Kahiko. My name is Kahiko. I'm a culture educator here at the British Hawaii Fishing Museum, and welcome to another edition of Kahiko Wednesdays. Today we're inside the area that we call Pacific Hall here in our Hawaiian Hall complex. Now originally, some of us might remember this place as Polynesian Hall, and indeed it was dedicated as such in 1894. But the iteration that we see now has undergone extensive renovations and really helps to bring to life not only the past of the Pacific Islands, sometimes what we call Oceania, but also the present. And to illustrate something that happened in the past and continues to happen in the present, we are here in front of our wonderful fishing case. Now, as we look across these many objects and pictures, we can pretty easily guess that this has to do with the many different ways that we, here in the Pacific, catch our main source of protein, which is often fish. In Hawaiian, we call fish i'a, and it's not simply fish that swim with fins and with flippers. I'a also includes animals like turtles, whales, and other kinds of marine creatures that move. But across the Pacific, whether it's i'a or ika, depending on what part of the island you come from, we gotta catch them in order to eat them. To start with that process, you have to have the tools by which we catch those fish. In Hawaii, we would call that practice lavaita, and there's similar words in other kinds of Pacific Island languages, particularly the Polynesian languages. But when we think about the lavaita, the people who catch fish, we can look at the tools that they use and get a glimpse into how they use them. Now, particularly these items here are fish hooks, what we might call makau in Hawaiian. In other Pacific Island languages, these would be called matau. But wonderfully, we know exactly what kind of fish these hooks are meant to catch. Now, in Hawaiian, the word aku might sound familiar to some of us. It is tuna. Across the Pacific, different species, different varieties of tuna abound. And they don't stay in one place, they tend to move. So, when the descendants of the Pacific Islands people that move out from places like Taiwan and China move into the islands, they find that the fish are there with them. So as we notice from these different kinds of fish hooks, that all have different sizes, some of them very different materials, there is a similar form, a similar shape. And that's because these hooks are designed to catch those aku, those tuna, without bait. One way that we can understand this is by looking at the components of these hooks. All of them are almost formed in the same way. You have a backing, which is made out of pearl shell. You have a point, which is sometimes made out of pearl shell, turtle shell, or in some cases bone, and they are lashed together in a very tight way. Now all of this comes together and adds to the allure of the hook to the tuna. So in the stories that we have about these kinds of lures, the tuna sees the shining of the pearl shell, which is usually the shank, and rising up from the water, it looks at it like a bait fish. As it comes up, it chomps down. And when you feel the weight of the fish on your line, whether it's a hand line or if it's on a pole, you pull. And very much like circle hooks, the modern circle hooks that we have nowadays, all you have to do is take it out of the mouth. You can throw it back into the bait ball or back into the sea wherever you happen to be fishing, and according to most traditions, you're just going to keep pulling up those aku. But specifically when we look at these, we should also understand that each of these hooks comes from a different part of the Pacific Islands. So one way that we can talk about the connections that we have here in the Pacific is by looking at the tools and the objects that we use, and also the similarities of materials, but the differences of materials. For example, this large lure down here uses a material that the rest do not commonly have. Now if you look closely, you'll notice that the point, the maka, is made out of turtle shell, and that is the honu ea, as we call it in Hawaiian, that is the hawksbill turtle. The back of the shank also has a layer of that turtle shell too. But the major component is whale bone. And that is not a frequently seen material in these kinds of hooks in other parts of the Pacific. Now, the hooks in Tonga, like that variety, go quite big. But in other parts of the world, in other places like Micronesia and other parts of Polynesia, the hooks tend to be a little bit smaller. Particularly when we look at number 27 here, not only do we lack turtle shell, but even the arrangement of the hook as it's tied onto the shank is very different. And the entire hook is made out of pearl shell. So depending on where we are, whether they are high volcanic islands or low coral atolls, the resources that we use will be different. But the forms that we put those materials into, how we shape those resources, often comes from a very similar origin. Now these are just some examples of fish hooks that we have here in the Pacific Hall, and these are some really nice examples of this style. But when we look at the larger types of fish hooks that are used to catch animals a bit bigger than aku and ahi, we can see there is definitely a similarity in style. Now these hooks that we see right here are primarily made out of wood. These top hooks are sometimes called shark hooks, and these hooks down here are known as revettus hooks. Now, shark hooks are easy enough to understand. They're hooks that are used to catch large sharks. In some cases, those might be sharks that are the size of reef sharks, blacktip sharks, Galapagos sharks like we have here in Hawaii. But even some of these large ones, depending on the area of the Pacific that you're in, could be used to catch animals as large as a great white, as they sometimes wander through. But these hooks, especially, are a little bit different. They're not quite as thick as the shark hooks that we have up here, although they are created in a very similar way. If you look closely at the incurved point of these revettus hooks, you'll notice that there are two pieces. These hooks tend to be grown in a J shape, and as close as you can get into that J shape, it will be cut when the time is appropriate. And another point with that very L-shaped incurve will be added on, and you can see in this example here that it's lashed together, so it's two pieces brought together. And one reason for that is two pieces lashed in this way make a stronger hook. But it also ensures that when that hook enters into the mouth of the fish, instead of giving it lots of wiggle room, it's a surefire way to make sure that fish is caught. Now these are the hooks that we would use for much, much larger fish. And there are many ways to catch sharks, for example, not just by fish hook. But when we get back to the smaller kinds of fish that we might find in reefs or other areas closer to islands, we can rely on styles of fish hooks like these that we see here. For example, in this section, there is a very similar sense of style. There's a very highly inturned point, there's a long curve, and some of these are well known in places like Tokelau or the Cook Islands. But we see some materials that are repeated. On the far end, by number 5, we see a piece of turtle shell that has been turned into a wonderful hook. Across the way, we also see pearl shell, the bright, gleaming, almost white colors of that pearl shell. And they can be made incredibly small, as in the example of number 2. But in between those, by number 4, we have a different material. Now you might think that that is like the turtle shell because it's brown, but it also resembles another material we've talked about. It resembles wood. And it does come from a plant that is a tree, but this in fact is made out of coconut shell, what we in Hawaiian call niu. And these kind of hooks are actually surprisingly strong. And if you ever tried to break open a coconut without stone or metal, you would realize that it makes a pretty good material for this purpose. But these designs are often used for deep sea fishing, and again the same principle applies. The fish will bite onto the baited or unbaited hook, and because of that very small space between the point and the shank, it tends to get caught very well, and then you pull up your fish. And while these are very functional hooks, before we finish today, I'd like to point out the idea that in the Pacific, as in other cultures, function and form are often tied together with things that are more important than, let's say, fishing, more important than building, things that become symbolic and ritual. In these examples here that we can see, there's one hook that stands out among the rest. And for now, I'll point that one out as number 8. You might notice that it's a very different color from anything else we've seen today. And that's because it is made out of a very special material that in its home is called pounamu. Pounamu is a Maori word, and some of us might translate that as nephrite jade in English, but pounamu as a material is very special to the folks in Aotearoa. But before I get into a little bit more of that, it sounds like we have a question that I might be able to answer for folks.
So these fish hooks that you were talking about, would these attach to the boat or were they handheld?
That's a great question. A lot of these hooks would potentially be hand-lined. So as opposed to having distinct attachments to the canoes that would be moving through the water, these could be held in the hand. And that is probably a good thing, especially if you're doing deep sea diving, or not deep sea diving, but deep sea fishing, because once you feel the change in the weight, you have a quick reaction time. Great question, by the way. But before we have any more questions, there's one more I'd like to answer.
What years were these hooks made?
That is another great question. Now, often we at the museum have information about when objects come to us, when they're donated, when they might be collected by researchers, or in some cases when cultural practitioners or other people make these things for us, we know exactly those dates. But as is the case with many collections, not only in our museum but in other places, we don't always know the exact date that these hooks are made. And you can trace some of these styles back to certain points in time in the Pacific, but at this moment, I can't say I'm exactly sure. But that's a great research question. So if you happen to be a PhD student or anybody else who's interested, you can check out our bishopmuseum.org website and maybe have a look through some of our ethnology entries, because you might just find some of that information there. But before I get any more questions, which are great, I would like to talk a little bit more about this wonderful matau honamu. We might be able to call this a hei matau, and in the Maori language, a hei matau, like a hei tiki, is a kind of adornment that is worn. But it's a very special adornment because it is made often out of that material, that honamu. And honamu has a lot of ritual significance to the folks down south in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And you might wonder, well, it's about the size of a functional hook, it's the shape of a functional hook, and it has a bit of a point. Should we be using it? Well, maybe. You could certainly put it on a line and put it into the water to catch ika, to catch fish. But for something made out of this special material, it might be better for you to adorn yourself or use it in a very special kind of ceremony than try to fish with it. So we see here the potential for a very functional form, a very functional object, to become something that is symbolic. And in places like Aotearoa, there are stories of a certain atua, a certain, what we would call in Hawaiian, a kupua. His name is Maui. And across the Pacific, he is known for many special things. One of those special things is the fishing up of islands. And it's sometimes a story that these hooks symbolize the great deeds that Maui undertakes, specifically the bringing up of the islands of the Pacific. In Hawaii, we have those stories. In Aotearoa, we have those stories. And across the Pacific, we have those connections that are made, not only to the physical things that help to bring us food, but the stories that they entail. And part of our mission here at the museum is to bring those stories to life in the way that we do. So for now, we're going to conclude our story today here during Wa Kahiko Wednesdays. My name is Kapali Kumaila, and it's been my pleasure and my honor to show you folks just a few of the treasures that we take care of here at the museum. But if you're interested in today, just wait till next week. So please, stay tuned. Same time, same channel, and as we say at the museum, it's never goodbye, it's ahui ho. So, ahui ho kaku.
Mahalo.